This podcast is a proud member of the Paranormality Podcast Network.
Okay. Show me.
Sometimes that is better.
Welcome to the Prairie Land Paranormal Podcast.
Be sure you never, ever scream.
A podcast where we will explore the dark corners of our world, the weird, the creepy, and the strange.
There are no accidents, no coincidences.
I am your host, Eric Carrier.
The boogeyman is real.
And they mostly come at night.
My co-host is Jessica Carrier.
Come out, wherever you are.
Thank you for joining us for a journey into the unknown.
Be one of us.
Let's get started with today's show. Hey guys, welcome to the show. This is the Prairie Land Paranormal Podcast, and I am your host, Eric Carrier. I'm here with my wife and my co-host, Jessica Carrier. Jessica, how are you today?
I'm doing great. It's a wonderful sunny day outside.
Jessica, what do we have in store for our listeners today?
Well, today we're going to be continuing our journey into near-death experiences. We had a great conversation last week with Dr. Donald Molnar about the science of near-death, but didn't really get a chance to share any experiences. So, we wanted to revisit this and share some near-death experiences.
Yes, this is primarily for my sister, who gave us a lot of guff about not having any experiences on that show. If you are a new listener and you are here for the first time, welcome. If you've been around for a while, welcome back. We know that there are a lot of podcasts out there that are competing for your time, and we are grateful that you're giving that time to us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Jessica, how can our listeners support our podcast?
If you'd like to support our podcast, there are a few ways you can do that. First, you can hit up our tip jar and leave us a small tip. Second, you can continue to share the show. Share it with your friends, share it with your family, share it with anyone really. Indie shows like ours thrive on word of mouth. Third, you can continue to vote for us on the Paranormality Podcast Network Paranormal Top 25.
Yes, please keep voting for us each and every month at paranormalityradio.com. This is a great way for us to get exposure and to reach out to new listeners.
The last way you can support our show is to come and hang out with us on social media. We have accounts on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and we love to hang out and meet you guys there.
All of those accounts can be accessed through our website at www.prairielandparanormalpodcast.com. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay, let's get started with today's show. Benjamin Franklin nailed it when he said, "But in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." Let's face it, none of us are getting out of this life alive. So it makes sense that people from the beginning of time have been curious about what is on the other side. What happens to us after we die? Do the religious scholars have it right, and we go to heaven or hell? Or maybe the atheists have it right, and we simply transition into nothingness. Or perhaps we simply become disembodied and live on as spirits roaming our favorite haunts.
In our last episode, we spent some time discussing the science behind near-death experiences with Dr. Donald Molnar. It's a fantastic episode, and if you haven't listened to that episode first, we would recommend that you start this journey there. But first, a disclaimer. While NDEs ultimately end well, they often get there under some truly traumatic situations. Some of the themes that will be discussed in this episode include traumatic deaths, drowning, illness, molestation, suicide attempts, spousal abuse, and drug overdose. If any of these themes might be distressing to you, we would invite you to skip this episode.
Before continuing, let's review the 12 possible parts of a near-death experience, as recorded by Dr. Jeffrey Long in his book, Evidence of the Afterlife, The Science of Near-Death Experiences. These include out-of-body experience, increased senses, intense positive emotions, going through a tunnel, a brilliant light, other beings, religious figures or family, alteration of time, life review, seeing otherworldly realms, learning special knowledge, coming to a boundary, and returning to the body.
Now that we have that freshly in our minds, let's take a look at a collection of NDEs that we put together that are both positive and negative, and see if they can help answer some of the afterlife's burning questions.
Death calls for us at every age, and sometimes even when we're playing. That's what happened to this child who fell 15 feet through a barn attic while playing with his cousins.
My cousins and I were in a hay barn in the attic. We were running around in circles when I fell 15 feet through a hole. I landed flat on my back and onto the concrete floor. My cousins said it all happened in a matter of seconds, but to me, it felt like a half hour. I recall floating above myself right after I landed. I could see myself lying there. Then it was super bright with clouds. Then it got dark and I woke up. I could stand up perfectly, but it felt like I weighed 1,000,000 pounds. I could barely walk. I vividly remember seeing myself from up above my body. It was peaceful, no sound, and filled with blindingly bright light.
Sometimes, death calls for us when we make mistakes, in situations we would otherwise be comfortable in and consider ourselves experienced in. That's what happened in this story of a woman who made a near-fatal mistake while rafting.
That summer, in 1971, I was with my husband and children in the mountains of northern Georgia while he was working with the camera crew of the movie Deliverance. On the weekends, some of the cast and crew and their families would take the rafts out on the river for a little R&R. They filmed on the same part of the Chattahoochee River we rafted on, and of 8 of us on this particular Sunday afternoon, 4 of us, including myself, had rafted down this stretch before. But the river was different this time, low from several days of no rain. Different paths had to be taken through many of the rapids. On the last set of rapids, we made an almost fatal mistake. The raft I was in got turned around, went over a 4-foot drop backwards, and became stuck there by the churning action of the water. The raft was trapped in a hydraulic, a white water phenomenon, which had held the raft against the rocks. I was thrown out and got caught between the raft and the rocks, with the force of the river pouring down on my head and the suction of the hydraulic motion pulling me under. A man inside the raft held my arm and tried to pull me back into the raft. But the most he could do was enable me to catch an occasional quick breath before the water sucked me back down. I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Very consciously and calmly, no panic at all, I knew I was going to die. It was just a matter of how. Being smashed into the rocks was painful, so I decided drowning was the better choice. The next time I had popped out of the water, with my last breath, I told him to let go. And he did. I felt the water pull me under, and I relaxed into it. I knew there was no point in struggling as I breathed in the water, and everything went black for a moment. The next thing I knew, I was 100 feet above the river, looking down at the stuck raft against the rocks below. I saw the 2 men in the raft looking for me to come out from underneath. I saw the other woman, who had been in our raft downstream, clinging to a rock. I watched my husband and my teenage sister, who had rafted without incident down the rapids ahead of us, come running back up the hill to find out why all the debris was floating down the river. We had taken everything out of their raft and put it into ours in case they flipped over. But They went down so easily. We just jumped in to follow them down. From above, I watched my husband climb onto a rock in the river. He couldn't hear what the two men who were still in the raft were shouting to him over the roar of the water. He had no idea where I was or what had happened, but he knew I was missing. He looked as if he wanted to jump in to try and find me, and I suddenly found myself at his side, trying to stop him because he wasn't much of a swimmer, and I knew there was no point. When I reached out to stop him, my hand went right through him. I looked at my hand and thought, oh my God, I'm dead. In that instant, total knowledge of reality appeared to me, and I saw the multi-dimensionality of the universe. My consciousness expanded so far beyond the physical plane that I was no longer aware of it, nor myself. I was so much a part of it all. There was no distinction. It was a brilliant flash of light, and I was allowed to see into it for a brief moment and experience a feeling of love so profound, powerful, and overwhelming that I can only describe it as pure bliss, even though that doesn't begin to describe it. Suddenly, I was whisked away and found myself traveling rapidly through a vortex towards a beautiful white light in the far, far distance. I continued to experience an overwhelming feeling of love within me and around me. There was no fear, no anxiety, and no worry. I even felt as if I'd done this before, and I was remembering that I was going home. I was filled with joy. I had no sense of a body, no feeling of limitations or boundaries. Yet, I was still me and aware that I was having this experience. Before long, I realized I wasn't alone. There was someone whom I can only describe as a loving being of light, traveling beside me at the speed of light. We communicated mentally. This was someone I have always known, and I knew that as soon as I sensed the presence of this being. Yet, I cannot now tell you who it was. I didn't have that sense that it was any familiar religious figure or deceased relative, but rather a special friend who was always with me wherever I am. Perhaps my guardian angel. This being told me telepathically that I had a choice about going back. I thought, no, I want this. I want this to go on for forever. Suddenly, we burst into the light and a whole new reality was revealed to me. Similar to the physical world, but in this higher vibration, more colorful, more beautiful, more amazing. I saw plants, trees, mountains, lakes, animals, and shimmering crystal-like buildings, some very large and ornate. I saw beings moving about, light beings, going about their daily lives. They don't have physical bodies, but they are distinct fields of energy. They don't walk, they float. They have lives much like ours, but without the struggles and sorrows. They are artists, musicians, dancers, singers, inventors, builders, healers, creators of magical things. Things they will manifest in their next lifetime in the physical universe. Again, the being of light told me it was my choice to stay or go. But there was more for me to do in that life, and it wasn't quite time for me to leave. Still hesitating, I was told that if I chose to go back, I would be given certain knowledge to take with me to share with others. After much discussion, I agreed to go back, and suddenly, I found myself in front of a tall, cone-shaped building. So tall, it seemed to go on forever. I was told This was the Hall of Knowledge. I entered the building and flew, spiraling upwards through what appeared to be shelves of books, like in a library. Many, millions of books, and I flew through them all. When I reached the top, I burst through it in a kaleidoscope of colors, and at the same time, my head popped out of the water. I was downriver about 10 yards from the raft. I immediately became aware of where I was, and I grabbed for the nearest rock. I was able to pull myself up and coughed up a lot of water. I was in a state of shock, but needed no medical attention. I don't know how long I was under the raft. No one was looking at their watch at the time. It could have been 3 or 4 minutes. It could have been 10. There was no time where I had been. I can't say that I was clinically dead, but I have no memory of struggling under the water or trying to hold my breath till I reached the surface. I've been a swimmer, water skier, scuba diver, and surfer, so I've had plenty of close encounters underwater before where I thought I might die, but nothing like this. Those other times, I remember perfectly well struggling to reach the surface, my lungs about to burst. What I do remember during the time my body was in the water under the raft is what I have told you.
Not all near-death experiences are positive. Here is a story of a woman who died from a drug overdose and went to a place where she felt tormented.
I was at work at a grocery store when my brother and his friend came to visit me. They had a drug called Spice, K2, that you smoke. I have a weak body, and the drug was very strong. I overdosed and passed out in the back of my brother's car. Then they left and were gone for at least 10 to 15 minutes. I remember seeing my body from above and having no physical feeling at all. I was then sucked downward and into an unending tunnel or vortex. It was very dark. There was red and orange flames everywhere. I was aware that I was dying and was frantic, but I could not escape and come back or wake up. There was the strongest emotional and spiritual feeling of being oppressed in every possible way. It was almost unexplainable how much emotional pain I felt. It was almost as if every negative feeling I had ever felt in my life were being forced on me at once. Flashes of my past, terrible choices and mistakes I had made flew by me. I also saw faces of my family members. They were all crying. I knew I was going to hell. And it was 1,000,000 times worse than I'd ever imagined. There was no physical pain, but I was being tortured emotionally for everything wrong I'd ever done in my life. In the spiritual world, this seemed to go on for many years, yet I was somehow aware that it was only minutes on earth. I remember being sorry for all the things I had done and having complete regret. I then was pulled out of the tunnel and hovered in light. I heard someone who I believe was God. He was telling me I was being saved and given a second chance at life. I immediately felt peace and could feel my body again. A few minutes later, my brother came back and shook me until I woke up. Often people report having feelings of complete peace and painlessness, even in the most traumatic of situations, such as in this story of a man who was hit by a car when he was riding his bike.
I was riding my bicycle when all of a sudden a car hit me broadside. I was flung forward about 12 feet, crashing down onto the right side of my skull. I realized that I was going to die. There was nothing scary about this, just a very calm and peaceful feeling. Then, all at once, I was hovering high up in the air, looking down and separated from my physical body that laid crumpled on the ground. There was no pain. As I looked down upon the group crowded in a circle over my inert body, I could distinctly hear the conversations taking place. All the while, I continued to bask in the feelings of warmth, peace, and tranquility. I could see the emergency medical workers putting me on a backboard and then lifting me onto a stretcher. Suddenly, I became aware of a kind of whooshing feeling and blackness as I was catapulted down back into my physical body. I remember my anger at having to leave, the shock of finding myself thrust back into a body that was screaming out in pain, and of course, the ultimate frustration of not being able to find the words to even remotely describe the full extent of my experience. There was no one that I could tell who wouldn't think that I was either crazy or just momentarily confused because of my head injury. All right, folks, sit back and we will be right back with some more near-death experiences after this break.
Hello, everyone. This is Brandon, the host of the Para-Unity Podcast, wanting to take a second to tell you about our show. The Para-Unity Podcast is your top choice for closing the distance between the paranormal groups. From ghosts to cryptids to ufology, we will discuss it all. The Para-Unity Podcast is aimed at promoting positivity and collaboration between investigators and is geared specifically for those in the field. But if you're not, you'll still get a kick out of the show as well, because you'll be able to think of it like ghost hunters talking shop. Tune in and join myself and all of our amazing guests as we entertain you with sensational stories of fantastic places, events, tips for your investigations, and so much more. And remember, you can find the Para-Unity Podcast on your favorite podcast directory and part of the Paranormality Radio Network.
The best part of a bonfire happens after the guitar has been put away, the s'mores have been eaten, and everyone is quiet, sitting in a circle, ready to swap scary stories. You're not scared now. There's safety in numbers. But how about on the walk home? Or the long drive down desolate country roads? What about when you get back to your dark house and you're all alone? Did you leave that window ajar? Was that chair always pulled out like that? What's that creaking noise upstairs? The West London Witch is a new podcast where we share real stories about those moments where we find ourselves very much not alone. You can find The West London Witch for free on all podcast streaming services, Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So come join us at The West London Witch for some truly terrifying tales from the other side.
Illness is a part of life, and sometimes illness and death call on us at a young age, such as in this story of a child who died after an illness that caused her to have a series of febrile seizures.
I was 4 or almost 5 years old. My experience was not near death, it was death. I was in my bed because I'd been very ill with fevers hitting 104. My mom said I hit 105 at one point. I remember being lowered into a cold tub of water by my mother, who was frantically trying to bring the fever down. I would hallucinate the same thing every time my fever got high. The ceiling would start bouncing back and forth like a rubber band, and then it would begin lowering down on me. I would cry out thinking I was going to be crushed. Looking back now, it was probably seizures. I was also vomiting every hour or so. This went on for like 3 days, and I still couldn't hold anything down. Mom took me to the hospital when she realized things were only getting worse. I was immediately rushed back into the emergency room. The room was busy with medical staff rushing around. They were asking Mom questions, and she answered while watching me. She looked really worried, like she was trying not to cry. I felt so tired. I just wanted to sleep for a while. I remember telling everyone I was feeling a lot better. The sounds in the room started to get a hollow echo, and all I wanted to do was close my eyes, so I did. The voices in the room continued to echo. I noticed my toes were touching the foot of the bed, and I thought, wow, I'm a big girl. I was so proud. I opened my eyes to look, and when I did, I was looking at myself. I was blue and I was lying on a gurney. My eyes were slits. There were people all around me frantically working, and my mom was crying as she looked on. I wasn't scared or upset, but I was a little confused. I knew I didn't have a body. I felt like I was a part of everything and everyone. I just floated up and I could see other rooms. I later detailed conversations that there is no way I could have known. I lifted out of the hospital and continued ascending. I began browsing through time. I even saw events from my short life. I later detailed things that occurred before I could talk. There were events that I should not have been able to remember, but I do, and in great detail. As I kept ascending, I felt at peace. There was no questions or unknowns. Time wrapped in on itself. There was no past, present, or future as we see it here. Everything happened now and all at one time. I felt no fears or worries. I began drifting towards a beautiful light, and I wanted to touch it. Suddenly there was a pop. It felt like I was attached to a cord when someone grabbed it and jerked me down. I descended almost instantly. I don't remember much after that. I don't even remember going home.
Depression and its unrelenting grip often cause people to spiral into a dark abyss where we might choose to do things we may later regret. This is the case with the next story of a young girl who attempted suicide.
I was 13 to 14 years old. A few months before, my stepfather had been convicted of molestation. I had been the key witness, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for his crime. My mother didn't want the case to go to court because she feared for our lives if he was to be released for any reason, as he was a violent man. My mother blamed me some because I had not told her sooner, and we were having problems with me being a rebellious teen, and her feeling is that she did not protect me well enough from this man. One night, my mother and her new boyfriend were going to go out on a date. I didn't want to be left alone, and I had a fit because I wasn't invited. My mother and I had a slight altercation, and she left me alone anyway and went out. After she left, I started thinking about all she had said during the fight and how she'd been treating me differently since the trial. And I got really mad, very mad, then very sad, and finally, I was tired of it all. Tired of knowing that this man had stolen my innocence for nearly 8 years of my life, and knowing that men would always be more important to my mother than me. I was tired of being teased in school because of what had happened, and I just decided that my life would never get any better, and I gave up. And I looked all over the house for any kind of pill I could find. My mother had been taking some nerve pills before and during the trial, so I looked for them. I found the pills and some mild medication and some other stuff that looked like it might cause drowsiness. I got on my favourite nightgown. I put it over my favourite shirt that had belonged to a best friend, and I sat on my bed, and I took all the pills, one by one, 42 in all. Then I wrote a note to tell my mum that I was sorry if I made her life too hard to live, and that I loved her and that I hoped she loved me too. I drank what was left of the water in my glass, lay down in my bed, placed my hands across my chest, and for all I can remember, went to sleep. During this sleep, I had a dream, but it wasn't a dream, if that makes any sense. I have no idea what day of my coma this happened, or if it happened while I was in my own bed. All I remember was a beautiful, white, bright light, and the overwhelming feeling of love and acceptance. I felt like this was the best feeling I could ever have asked for. I've never felt that kind of love before or since. I knew there was someone, something there with me. This person, thing, turned out to be a huge hand raised up as if to warn me to stop. The hand was illuminated and whiter than the surrounding whiteness. I heard a voice coming from the direction of the hand, and it said, "Go back. It's not your time." Then the next thing I remember was feeling sad again, and I had something in my nose. I could hear my mother and my cousin Chris talking to each other. I don't remember what they were saying, but could tell who they were. When I woke from my coma, I asked my mum what Chris was doing there, and she said, "How did you know that he was here? You were still out of it." I told her that I could hear them talking. Then I said, "Mama, it was so beautiful." She asked what I was talking about, and I told her what I just told you. It was hard for me to talk because I had a tube in my nose. Going into my stomach, it was pumping in something black. Soon after that, my doctor came in and talked with me some, and then they took the tube out, and then he came back and scolded me for trying something like this and that. I should never do it again. Always wait one more day, he said. Then he said, "If you still feel like doing it, call me and I'll be glad to talk to you." That same day I told my mum that the heels of my feet hurt, and she began to cry. It seems she had pulled me out of bed that next morning after trying to wake me up for school, and she had by herself dragged me to the car and drove me to the hospital. My feet had hit all 4 of the steps out of our front door. My mum was 4 foot 10 inches tall, and I was about 5 foot tall and weighed at least 50 pounds heavier than her. She also told me that she said a prayer for me while I was in the coma. Her prayer was not what I would have expected. "God, please let my child live." Instead she said, "God, if her life will be better than it is now, please let her live. If it's not, please take her so she won't suffer anymore." I cried. I cried when she told me that, and I thanked her for her selflessness.
Again, not every near-death experience is positive. Here is another story of a woman who died after a drug overdose and was taken to a place of desolation.
I was given a drug that was laced with fentanyl. I knew immediately afterwards that I was going to die. I fell backwards and continued falling for what seemed like forever. I saw glimpses of my life from the very beginning and only visions of everything I had ever done wrong. I kept falling until I found myself in the middle of the city where I was born. It looked like the city had been hit by a bomb, and I was the only person there. I had an overwhelming feeling that I was in hell. I had been shown the reasons why God had sent me to hell while I was falling. I knew that I had caused myself this outcome, and I knew it was too late to change. Then suddenly, I was back in my own body. I was alive. I was so excited and grateful for God blessing me with this wake-up call. I have gone from questioning if God exists to sharing this story with others in hopes of it changing other people's lives. I was shown that if I didn't get my life together now, I would spend eternity suffering in hell. Heaven has to exist because I know for sure that I've been to hell. I know I never want to spend eternity living with nothing but my mistakes and guilt holding me down.
Sometimes death calls for us at the hands of others, even the hands of someone who may have once loved us, such as this woman who died after being strangled by her ex-husband.
My husband and I were separated. I was hiding with 2 small children. One was 16 months old. One morning, I'd had a particularly bad encounter with my husband after a morning with lawyers. I had driven him there, as he does not drive. I knew that if I didn't take him to the meeting, he wouldn't go. So I drove him. On return to the matrimonial home where I no longer lived, he asked me to come inside. I made an excuse to avoid going inside. As soon as he stepped out of the car, I pulled away from the curb. I was shaking violently. I drove straight to my friend's house where my son was waiting for me. Lunchtime had passed, and I wanted to get him home for his nap. My friend asked me to stay. She had a bad feeling. I know now that she had a directive from the Holy Spirit, but I didn't understand those things yet. She could see that I was agitated, and she pleaded with me not to leave. But I needed to sort out my thoughts, so I promised her that as soon as my son woke from his nap, I would come back. She reluctantly let me go. The drive from her house to mine was only a few minutes away. By the time I got home, my son was asleep in his car seat. I had a routine when he was asleep. I would take him from the car, carry him over my shoulder to the house, unlock the front door, and take him straight up to his bed. Then I would come downstairs immediately and open the garage. Then I would drive the car into the garage and close the door. The car would be hidden and the door would be locked behind me. All that remained to be done was to lock the door to the house. All of this took no more than 4 minutes. As I was tucking my son into his cot, I thought how peaceful he was, a small consolation in the midst of chaos. I was just coming down the stairs when I heard someone come into the hallway through the front door. I thought it must be one of my neighbors, who might have seen me come home, probably looking for a cup of tea and a chat. I turned the corner at the bottom of the stairs and came face to face with my soon-to-be ex-husband. How had he found my house? I thought I was hidden. How had he found me? How had he gotten here? Panic rose up within me. He had not been anywhere in sight when I pulled into my driveway, and there was nowhere to hide outside. It was a street of row houses with no spaces between them. There was no lush shrubbery to hide behind, no single buildings to hide behind. There just wasn't anywhere to hide. Where had he come from? I had only been upstairs a minute or two. I thought, oh God, help me. I knew instinctively that I had to keep him away from the baby. So I did the only thing I could do under the circumstances. I invited him into the living room. I went to the kitchen to put on water for tea. That would give me a minute or two to think. I knew he wanted to talk, but that was the last thing I wanted to do. The living room was sparsely finished. I sat in my one armchair, and he sat on the edge of the sofa. I was tense. My husband started to talk. He wanted me to come back to him, to give him another chance. He wanted us to be a family. He could not see that it was much too late for that, because he had destroyed any trust, love, or positive feelings I might have once had for him. He was begging me now. I can't let you go. I can't let go of the children. I can't let you go. In anguish, I thought, oh God, I need your help. I can't handle this. Inside, I was screaming. Momentarily, I steered the conversation away from us. I was desperate. I thought he might actually leave, but he stayed. And then he asked to borrow my car. I had to get him out of my house. My husband did not have a driver's license. He had never driven a car as far as I knew. At that moment, I didn't care if the car ever came back. If that's what it would take, he could have the car. I was past rational thinking. I asked him to have our mutual friend return the car, and to return in time for me to pick up my daughter from school. And then, almost as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. I was left in a cold sweat. It was minutes after 3 o'clock, and I needed to pick up my daughter from school. My son was still asleep, but I would not wake him up until the last minute. I would have to get him up about 10 after 3. It was just about 9 minutes past 3 when the car pulled up in the driveway. The bright sun of the afternoon glanced off the hood. I could not see the face of the driver, but assumed it was our mutual friend. The driver opened the door, and he got out of the car. It was my husband. I only had 20 minutes now to wake up the baby, get to school, and collect my daughter. I hoped I could get the keys from my husband without letting him in the house. But he marched forcefully into the house before I could get to the door to lock it. He was carrying a manila envelope, and he was angry again. He strode into the kitchen and threw the envelope onto the table. Yelling at me, he picked up the envelope and took out the separation agreement. In defiant anger, he scrawled his name across the bottom. Still yelling at me, he signed. "If that's what you want, you can have it," he snarled. I had to get away from that anger. I retreated into the living room. He followed. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the sofa. He began to plead with me not to do this to him. I sat in the armchair like a stone. I was powerless. I hated him, and I wanted him to leave, but couldn't move because I was afraid of him. I could not afford to make a wrong move now. My husband came over to me and rested a hand on my knee. He was crying now, saying, "I can't give you up. I can't give you up." Without warning, his fingers tightened on my leg. I looked quickly into his eyes. "I won't give you up," he snarled. I watched his personality change in the space of 1 or 2 seconds in front of my eyes. I had seen this before when he was drinking, but this time he was sober and very dangerous. It was fast and unmistakable, like someone had drawn a shade over the window of his soul. Before I had time to react, his hands flew to my throat and he began choking me. I thought, oh God, he was going to kill me. And then he said it. "I'm going to kill you." I tore at his hands and we both fell to the carpet. I tried to pull his hands away from my neck, but he was far too strong for me. I could only get a finger or two between his hands and my throat. I couldn't breathe. I rolled on the carpet, taking him with me. His grasp loosened for a mere second. It was enough to get a breath. We wrestled some more. He was yelling and cursing me. My heart was pounding. Each time I managed to loosen his grip enough to take a ragged breath, his fingers found my neck again with renewed force. I was choking to death and was going to die. On the verge of passing out, my children flashed through my mind. I wondered what would happen to them. Who would care for them? I couldn't die. I had babies to care for. I lashed out with my arms and legs and I landed a blow. My husband's grip slipped momentarily and I scrambled away from him. I had to get to the door, but he was too quick for me. He blocked the passageway to the kitchen, causing me to lunge for the door. He leaped back into the passage with a glint of metal in his hand. He grabbed me and threw me to the ground. My arms instinctively came up to shield my face as his hand swung toward me. I was crouching underneath him now, and one of my hands clawed at his throat. I tried to thrust my knee into his groin. I tried to bite and kick him, anything to get away from him. We continued wrestling against each other, first in the hallway and then in the living room. There was bloodstains on the carpet now. There were splashes of blood on the walls. He had me pinned to the floor, and for the third time he snarled, "I'm going to kill you." Although I was still fighting back, I could not breathe. He had successfully cut off my air supply, and I knew that I was going to die within the next few seconds. I surrendered, and all panic left me. As I slid into the darkness, I said in my mind, "I'm ready to die, Lord." A pure, brilliant light engulfed me, and I no longer had a physical body. But I still existed. I had no eyes to see, but I looked at everything around me. I was in the center of a vast nothingness. But the nothingness was not empty. It was completely filled with the presence of the living God. There are no words in the English language to describe where I was. I was in the middle of glory. When the Lord wrapped me in his love and held me to his breast, I was filled to every fiber of my being with his peace that possesses all understanding. I felt the love he had for me. I never knew he loved me so much. Wrapped in that love, wrapped in the arms of my Father, I surrendered my will, myself, and everything that I was, completely and without hesitation. I was in the arms of my Father, and all I wanted was to stay there forever. I told my Father that I was ready to come home. My Father spoke words only for me. But what I can share was that he had told me that giving my will, myself, and my life to him was what he was waiting for. And then he told me that he was taking me back because it was not a good time for me to come home yet. My Father gave me new life, physically and spiritually. He brought me back to the floor of the small living room. He released my husband's grip from my throat and pushed him away from me. I slowly became aware of being back in the world. My entire body hurt as I was lying on the carpet of that living room. When I slowly opened my eyes, I saw my husband sitting a few feet away from me, crouched on the carpet. Tears were running down his face and there was blood everywhere. His shirt and pants were covered in blood, and he was crying and groaning. Gradually, I was able to hear the words. He kept repeating, "What have I done? Oh God, what have I done?" I didn't understand why he was covered in blood. I didn't know then that he was covered in my blood. He was sobbing with his face buried in his hands. I was no longer afraid. I had faced death and all fear was gone. I knew I had to get him out of my house. He was beginning to babble incoherently now. I spoke, and when he saw that I was alive, he rose shakily to his feet. For the first time, he seemed to notice that he was covered in blood. He became frightened. I got up off the floor, slowly, and stood, speaking quietly. There was little left to my voice because of the damage to my throat. My throat hurt and my voice was rasping, but I still had to convince him to leave. He begged me not to phone the police, and I assured him that I wouldn't. Whatever he wanted to hear was what he would hear. But we both knew that he could not leave with blood all over his clothes. I went upstairs and grabbed a pair of pants that I hoped would fit him. When I gave them to him, he quickly put them on, but kept his grip on the bloody ones. He was uncertain what to do. He started to become agitated and irrational again. I was talking to him, trying to say things that he wanted to hear. At the same time, I tried to guide him towards the front door. To this day, I do not know what made him leave. It could only have been the Lord. It seemed as though I literally pushed him down the hallway and out the front door. I remember locking the door as soon as I had pushed him out. Then I ran back to the kitchen so I could see what direction he ran. It took all of 5 seconds to reach the kitchen window, but when I looked out, he was gone. There was no trace of him. He had vanished without a trace. That's when my body went into shock. There is a police report and a hospital report on this, and there were photographs of my injuries. When I was taken to the hospital, a police guard was placed outside the door of my room. In less than 6 months, I moved, got a divorce, changed names for me and my family, and went into hiding. My ex-husband, while he lives in a different country, is still alive and very dangerous.
We would like to thank you for joining us, and we hope that you've enjoyed this collection of near-death experiences. While death and the afterlife is still a mystery to most of us, to those who have experienced a near-death experience, the experience is absolutely real, lucid, and life-changing. One thing is for sure, the similarities and the sometimes extremely personalized nature of these stories can't just be chalked up to hypoxia, hallucinations, or drug overdose. Despite length or nature, all near-death experiences are significant and impart learning and meaning to our possible existences after life. If you've had a near-death experience that you would like to share, we would love to hear from you and share that with our audience. All right, folks, that is going to conclude this episode. We appreciate you joining us.
We'll see you next time.
All right, folks, that's the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you listening. If you have enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing through your favorite podcast player. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And remember that if you've had a paranormal experience that you would like to share, you can email us at prairielandparanormalpodcast@gmail.com, Or you can submit that experience through our website at www.prairielandparanormalpodcast.com. So, until next time, remember, don't be normal when you can be paranormal.